A group of soldiers stands on a deserted beach. Only a fraction of the men who started out is still alive to feel the overwhelming dread creep in as they realize they have no way home. A man sits in a dimly lit room, a typewriter before him, the fate of millions in his hands, and no clear way out of the catastrophic conflict that has engulfed the entire world. A global superpower forces those under its regime into terrified submission by the overt threat of torture and death for those who speak out against or find solace in anything that is not the state's tyranny. These three separate scenarios seem impossible. These three sets of obstacles seem insurmountable, and failure seems inescapable. These should be the stories of loss, of defeat, of tragedy, but they are not. These are the beginnings of three of the greatest strategic feats known to man, the most effective uses of tactics and cunning that turned the tide of three wars that seemed already to be won. Three stories with one common theme, one crucial shared tactic. As Sun Tzu puts it in his book, The Art of War, quote, "If you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear 100 battles," unquote. This is the strategy that changed the world and defined the future. The first scenario is not a historical event. It is a dramatic fictional account of perhaps the first recorded strategic maneuver as told by poets over 2,000 years ago. This parent of modern strategic warfare is, of course, the Trojan horse, as told in the Aeneid by Virgil. The legend begins in the 10th year of a siege that was only supposed to last a few months. None of the attacks the Greek army had launched had brought them any closer to victory. Morale was at an all-time low, and the men were becoming desperate. Then, out of the cries of despair, came a voice of reason. This voice of reason, however, was not that of a great general. It was the unimpressive voice of a simple-looking man from the insignificant island of Ithaca, a man by the name of Odysseus. Odysseus did not have skill in fighting, but he had something none of his fellow Greeks did. Odysseus knew his enemy. Odysseus knew that there had been a prophecy about the city of Troy, foretelling that the city would never fall to any outside force. Odysseus took note of this, weighed his resources, and came up with his plan. Troy was never going to fall to any outside force, so all the Greeks needed to do was find a way inside the city. The Trojans would be expecting a huge final attack, one last pathetic stand made by the remaining Greeks, so imagine their surprise when the next morning outside the city there was not an army of fierce warriors, but rather a gigantic wooden horse. Thinking that the prophecy about Troy's walls had been fulfilled and their enemy had fled, the Trojans joyfully brought the horse inside their city as a symbol of victory. This was their fatal mistake, a mistake Odysseus knew they would make. He knew the Trojans were so convinced no outside force would ever defeat them that they would never consider the forces they brought inside their own walls. The rest of the story is simple. The Greeks waited in the hollow body of the horse, and after their enemies fell asleep, crept out and took the city from the inside, fulfilling the prophecy that Troy would never fall to any outside force. While this story is just that, a story, the strategy used is far beyond that of a children's tale. This story, seemingly insignificant when compared to other more typical legends of heroes slaying monsters, survives because it is the first record of true strategic thinking. That is, learning how one's enemy thinks and using that against them. In the myth, Odysseus learns how his enemy thinks. He reasons what his enemy is expecting, and he plays on the pride of his enemy to successfully pull off one of the most daring missions of mytho-history, becoming the first to utilize a strategic method that is still taught in military officer training to this day. Consider your resources, note your enemy's weakness, and make your plan. The second scenario is a historical event, but it may as well be from a legend. It is a thrilling account of a true story as recorded in Ben Macintyre's book, Operation Mincemeat. Towards the end of World War II, Italy, more specifically Sicily, was the most strategic piece of land that either side could occupy. Sicily at the time was under the control of the Nazis, but if the Allies were to take it, it would turn the tide of the entire war. The problem? Hitler knew this just as well as Churchill did. The solution? Churchill knew something Hitler didn't. Churchill knew his enemy. Churchill selectively hired what he called corkscrew thinkers as tacticians in MI6 because he knew that the German tacticians thought in straight lines and therefore would never understand the tactics employed by the British. One of Churchill's corkscrew thinkers, an agent by the name of Ian Fleming, came up with an idea to take Sicily and in turn win the war. Fleming's corkscrew idea was this. MI6 was going to find a newly deceased body, dress it in a British uniform, and leave it floating off the coast of Spain with a briefcase full of false information that told of an upcoming Allied invasion of, not Sicily, but Greece, and let the strategy run its course. This process, however, took a great deal of attention to detail. A body had to be found, a uniform had to be made, and a backstory had to be constructed. MI6 even went as far as to have one of their secretaries pose as the officer's girlfriend and write fake love letters to plant in the pockets of his uniform. At dawn on a morning in April 1943, the body was picked up by a fisherman off the south coast of Spain. The body was then turned over to the Nazis, who ordered that the documents found on the body be translated and sent to Berlin. The Nazis were good strategists, but they made the defining error of neglecting to consider how their enemy thought. The Nazis would never make the connection that the body of the strapping young officer they had just found off the coast of Spain was really that of a hobo from a morgue in England. The Nazis then received orders to move the German troops that occupied Sicily to Greece, to defend Greece from the upcoming Allied attack. An attack that never came. Due to the weakened defense of Sicily, the Allies were able to take Sicily in July of 1943, ensuring the downfall of Mussolini's entire regime. All because of a dead homeless man and a corkscrew thinker. The ending of World War II was redetermined. Churchill and his corkscrew thinkers proved that the strategy of consider your resources, note your enemy's weakness, and make your plan had not died out with the ancients. No, it lived on as a shining beacon of tactical brilliance. These stories are impressive in their own right, but it is the third scenario that truly adds legitimacy to the strategy of knowing your enemy. This final scenario is not one that is usually associated with strategy, but it is the flawless work of the greatest strategist of all time, the originator of the strategic process of consider your resources, note your enemy's weakness, and make your plan. A strategist who is always at work, and who knows not only his enemy, but everyone and everything. The Roman Empire in the year 33 AD was beginning its climb into becoming a superpower of Western civilization, and it was a ruthless regime. Its leaders used fear and execution, especially crucifixion, as a means of keeping the Roman citizens, particularly the Jews, in a stranglehold. The Jews were a problem for Rome. They had one God whom they served and would not bow to the false idols they were expected to honor. The Jews had been praying for a long-awaited savior to come free them from this tyranny, but it seemed that this king would never come. Then, when he did come, he came as a baby. He didn't have an army. He didn't have riches. Jesus was not what the Jews were expecting their savior to look like. But this was intentional. So when this savior, Jesus, got a significant following, not because of his outward appearance, but because of the truth that he spoke, the Roman leaders realized that Jesus was a threat, and they must act. The longed-for savior of the Jews was flogged, spat on, and killed in a horrible manner. He was killed. His followers were terrified, and the problem of Rome had been solved. Or so they thought. What the Romans had neglected to consider is the fact that God is sovereign over everything. God knew his enemy. God knew that Satan's victory would be Jesus' death, and that Rome's victory would be the continued subjugation of its citizens. God knew all these things, and he played to the big picture. Freeing God's people from their earthly oppressors was not enough. They had to be freed from fear and death itself. That Jesus died a humiliating, torturous death was part of the ultimate strategy. That Jesus rose from the dead in unimaginable glory was the most brilliant strategic move that has ever been made. It meant the defeat of fear and death as well as sin, and that the war of human existence had been turned from a defensive struggle to an offensive charge. Because of the crucifixion, there is nothing that can hold God's people back now. Sin has been vanquished, death has lost its sting, and fear has no bearing. These stories are three applications of the same strategy. Consider your resources, note your enemy's weakness, and make your plan. These are stories of feats that seemed impossible, but were accomplished nonetheless, not because the victors were the ones expected to succeed, but because they were not. Sun Tzu writes that, quote, "The opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself," unquote. The Trojans brought the horse inside their walls. The Nazis brought the false documents to Berlin. Death was allowed to take Jesus, so that in his resurrection, there would be no doubt that this was the Son of God. Achieving the impossible lies only in turning perceived disadvantages into resources, and considering those resources and the enemy's weakness as the first steps of the great strategy. The strategy that changed the rules of warfare and rewrote history. Thank you.